Leading Britain's conversation, The Nigel Farage Show.
Mr. Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Donald, and good evening, everybody. Well, President Trump once again making the news, announcing that the US Embassy will be moving from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in a few years' time, and more of that later on in this show. But for today, it's been a very busy Brexit day in Westminster. And while I have to say, as somebody who has fought and believed in Brexit for nearly all of my adult life, one that I find a little bit depressing, I feel that this government is selling out on the Brexit that we voted for. That's my view. But to talk us through the day's proceedings, blow by blow, is Theo Usherwood, LBC's political editor. Good evening, Theo.
Tonight, Nigel, Tory Eurosceptics are getting very, very twitchy. In this first phase of negotiations, Britain has lost on pretty much every key point. The divorce bill, we're paying north of £45 billion.
I know.
The 3 million EU citizens living here in the UK will still be protected by the European Court of Justice. And now it looks like Theresa May will have to bring the whole of the UK into line with EU rules and regulations in order to keep the DUP on side. The negotiating strategy is falling apart, and the government is starting to look incompetent, perhaps best summed up by David Davis's appearance before the Brexit Select Committee. Only last month, Mr Davis insisted, as he had done previously, that his department had completed 58 sector-by-sector impact assessments. But under questioning from Labour's Hilary Benn, the Brexit Secretary admitted that they didn't actually exist.
So there's no sort of systematic impact assessment.
So the answer to the question is no.
Yeah.
So the government hasn't undertaken any impact assessments on the implications for leaving the EU for different sectors of the British economy. So there isn't one, for example, on the automotive sector.
On the
automotive sector?
No, not I'm aware of. No.
Is there one on aerospace?
Not I'm aware of.
No. One on financial services?
Well, I think the answer is going to be no to all of them.
No to all of them. Right.
Theo, I'm looking at David Davis today. He looked pretty beaten up.
He did, and it is appearing as if he is increasingly sidelined. At the moment, Tory MPs are focusing their anger on the officials surrounding the Prime Minister. Mr Davis now doesn't seem to be part of that main negotiating team. Ollie Robbins, the UK's chief Brexit negotiator in Brussels, and Sir Jeremy Hayward, the Cabinet Secretary, are known to favour a soft Brexit, and they appear to be calling the shots. The feeling in the tea rooms, as I said, is they're winning the war for Mrs May's ear. One of the main gripes also from ministers is that they've never really got, those individuals have never really got behind Brexit. They've never been the ones to sell those so-called sunny uplands. The narrative has always been coming out of the government about limiting the suffering that will be inflicted upon the British people once we leave the European Union. The chief Eeyore of the government is perhaps the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, and as if on cue, he appeared before the Treasury Select Committee today. There was no end Brexit plan, which of course many Brexiteers want to see, what the country will look like. And then he dropped this bombshell, telling Labour's cabinet.
Exit payment, I'll call it an exit payment for these purposes, contingent upon a future trade relationship.
Nothing is agreed until everything's agreed in this negotiation. But I find it inconceivable that we as a nation would be walking away from an obligation that we recognised as an obligation. That's just not a credible scenario. That's not the kind of country we are, and frankly, it would not make us a credible partner for future international agreements.
So Theo, we pay an extraordinary bill, whatever happens.
Exactly. So we don't get a trade deal, and we're going to end up paying £45 billion.
Oh dear.
Philip Hammond thinks that that's the way Britain should do its business. A quick update, I should say, from Number 10 on both of those points. Firstly, Theresa May's spokesman was asked today this afternoon why the Cabinet had never discussed the Brexit end state, and he said that they will discuss it before the end of the year. And then he rebuked Mr Hammond, saying nothing is agreed until everything agreed. That line coming out from PMQs. That also applies to the divorce bill. In the House of Commons, of course, it was a difficult day for Mrs May at PMQs. Jeremy Corbyn didn't do as well as he should have done, as per, but in the perhaps most scathing questions came from the Prime Minister's own side, including this one from Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Before my right honourable friend next goes to Brussels, will she apply a new coat of paint to her red lines? Because I fear on Monday they were beginning to look a little bit pink.
No, I can happily say to my honourable friend that the principles on which this government is negotiating were set out in the Lancaster House speech, they were set out in the Florence speech, and those principles remain.
Well, who better to go to than straight to the Conservative Member of Parliament for North East Somerset, who raised that question today during PMQs. Joining me now is Jacob Rees Mogg. Good evening, Jacob.
Hello, good evening, Nigel.
So, Jacob, Monday was very nearly a really bad day for Brexiteers, wasn't it?
Well, the problem with Monday was that it ignored that we're the Conservative and Unionist Party, that everyone said it was the Ulster Unionists, or the DUP, who objected, but hardly anybody in the Conservative Party would support a deal that separated Northern Ireland from the rest of the United Kingdom. It's one of the things that people like Dominic Grieve and I agree on, that the United Kingdom must be treated as a whole.
So how can it be, given those circumstances, that the Prime Minister had agreed a text with Mr Varadkar from Ireland, a foreign country, and they'd agreed a text, and the deal was that it should not be shown to Arlene Foster and the Democratic Unionist Party until they were on the verge of signing it? I mean, Jacob, when quite rightly Arlene Foster vetoed this whole idea of separating Northern Ireland off and giving it a different constitutional position, you praised Arlene Foster, didn't she?
Oh, yes, I think Arlene Foster is the new heroine of Brexit because her intervention was extremely important.
So we put more faith then in Arlene Foster than Theresa May, do we?
Well, it seemed a most extraordinary state of affairs. I don't think that set of words could have survived within the Conservative Party, and the government's official view is that they hadn't agreed it, and they seem to be indicating that the Irish Prime Minister is rather overstating the position. And I'm happy to give Mrs May the benefit of the doubt on that. If it's choice between believing the British Prime Minister or the Irish Prime Minister, I'll back the British Prime Minister.
Well, that's well and good you saying that, but I detected from the tone of your question today that you feel there is significant slippage. And let's face it, Jacob, whether it comes to the role of the European Court of Justice, whether it comes to this astonishing Brexit bill that apparently this government is preparing to pay, whether it comes to equivalence of laws, now not just for Northern Ireland, but for the whole of the United Kingdom. I mean, isn't the Brexit that you and I campaign for with such passion and vigour, isn't it, under this Prime Minister, beginning to slip away?
Well, I was very encouraged by the Prime Minister's response to my question, that she stood by the Lancaster House speech, which is very clear on all those points that you raise. It's clear on the European Court, and that is a worry I share with you. It's clear on money, and it's clear on being out of the single market and the customs union. I'm afraid the Chancellor's comments, which I only heard in full when you broadcast them a moment ago,
yes,
fail to understand the law that the House of Lords, in a very good report in March of this year, set out quite clearly that when we leave, under Article 50, if we don't have a specific agreement making provision for money, we owe them nothing under UK, international or EU law. And for the Chancellor to pretend that we owe fictional amounts without having come to an agreement is simply factually wrong. And I cannot understand why a Chancellor, when money is so short, when we have the threat to the Royal Marines, when the newspapers have been saying the army may go down to 50,000, when the NHS needs money, that he should be saying, well, we'll give them 40 billion because we committed to in a previous life. I thought that was a very deeply disappointing comment.
Yes, no, I'd agree with that totally. In fact, wholly irresponsible with taxpayers' money without any need to do so. No, I completely understand that. But Jacob, you're a very loyal party man, and I understand that. But it does seem to me that when Theresa May gets up at the Lancaster House speech, or whether she gets up at the Commons today, she parrots out these lines that she's probably been told in her briefing is what she has to say. But then her actions outside of these set-piece debates do appear to be very different indeed. And given that you raised this concept earlier on today, when it comes to this Brexit settlement, and bear in mind that they're trying to get some form of agreement ahead of all the heads of Europe meeting on the 14th and 15th of December next week, what are your red lines?
My reddest of red lines is always the European Court of Justice, because it seems to me that as long as we remain under the European Court of Justice, we haven't left the European Union. That if we accept, which I think would be a huge error, regulatory alignment, at least if we're outside the ECJ, we would then be able to change that later. So that the reddest of red lines is the ECJ. I'm very deeply concerned about regulatory alignment because that denies us one of the great benefits of leaving. But it is a secondary red line to the ECJ.
And if they say to you, well, Jacob, don't worry too much about it, the ECJ will only have jurisdiction over this country, over the rights of EU citizens and maybe a few laws, just for a period of 5 years, and after that it will expire. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think the issue of the ECJ having jurisdiction over foreign nationals living in this country would be akin to the arrangements you have in a colony. This is what happens with American troops in Okinawa, that they are subject to US law rather than Japanese law, or were historically. That cannot be something that a sovereign nation can accept. The time limit issue may change it. The advisory issue may make it less severe than it currently sounds. But I can't understand why we think a foreign court should have any say in this country, because the opposite won't apply. British citizens' rights in EU member states will not be protected by the British court for a 5-year period. So why should we accept it in return?
Well, perhaps you better go and knock on the door of number 10 and explain that to the Conservative government, Jacob, because
my views have been made clear, both publicly and privately. I wouldn't worry about that. Whether they take any notice is another matter.
And how far away are we from 48 backbenchers giving their letters to the 1922 committee and a challenge to Mrs May's leadership?
I think a long way. I'm still supporting Mrs May. I think that her Lancaster House speech is a very good basis for leaving. I think she is overwhelmingly the best leader we could have to get us safely to Brexit. So she genuinely has my full support. But Monday gave rise to some concerns with me and others, which is why this week I've asked both her and the Secretary of State for leaving European Union questions. But today's answer was much more reassuring than yesterday's answer.
Provided the red line of the ECJ and them not having jurisdiction is maintained.
That's absolutely right. That is a key red line, and I imagine it is for you as well.
Absolutely, and for 17.4 million people, Jacob,
right.
who voted Brexit,
yes.
And they don't want foreign courts ruling over us. Jacob Rees Mogg, thank you very much indeed for coming on and explaining your position. And Jacob Rees Mogg there, fiercely loyal to his party leader, but I think you can detect just from the tone of the question that he asked in the House of Commons today, I think a lot of people are getting Brexiteers are getting very, very worried, and a lot of Remainers are beginning to get really quite hopeful. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 7:16. It is clear to me from everything that happened on Monday with the attempted foisted deal put upon Northern Ireland to Philip Hammond today saying we will pay some extraordinary bill regardless whether there's any deal in return or not, despite legally not having to do so, that our government is doing everything it can to try to portray the kind of Brexit that 17.4 million people thought they were voting for. And as for Mrs May standing up in question time and saying, we'll leave the single market, we'll take back control of our borders and our lives. Frankly, she's like a parrot being wound up at the back with the civil service. She says these things in speeches and thinks it'll all be okay. Her actions are very different. No deal is a lot better than what they're trying to sell us out for. But I'm guessing that the Prime Minister thinks that ultimately she could rely on getting enough support in the House of Commons for a very, very bad deal. And at the moment, and we heard Jacob Rees Mogg, and we listened to Peter Bone earlier today, at the moment, the rebels are just about managing to maintain party loyalty. I'm not sure that can last for much longer. So tell me I'm wrong. I think the government is selling out on the Brexit we voted for. If you disagree with that fundamentally, call me on 0345 6060 973, or perhaps you think, no, Nigel, you're bang on the money, in which case you can text to 84850 and you can respond to anything I've said or Jacob Rees Mogg has said by tweeting using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC, and of course you can not just watch us on Facebook, you can comment there too. And Simon on Facebook's got some advice for me. He says Brexit will be reversed by Easter at the latest. The madness will end. We can reform the EU from within as a full member state. Don't make me laugh, Simon. We tried that for 40 years. For 40 years, we said we were going to reform the Common Agricultural Policy. We achieved nothing. And even when Cameron said, look, unless you give me something, guys, we may vote to leave, they still gave nothing, and since we voted Brexit, they've gone full speed ahead for a European army and for everything else. Rick says, Jacob, Nigel, you both know that May is going to sell us up the river. Well, whether it's up the river or down the river, Rick, I'm not sure. But yeah, I'm pretty clear about it. And I think Jacob is too. He's just a little bit too polite to say so. Let's go straight to the callers. Richard from Chester, who is a new caller to this show. Good evening, Richard.
Good evening, Nigel. How are you?
I'm fine. I just can't believe this Prime Minister who stands up and gives these speeches, Richard. And when she gave the Lancaster House speech in January, I was as generous as I ever could have been to any party leader. I said I really agreed with what she said, but I'm afraid her actions are very, very different.
I just want to first say thank you for everything you did and bring about the referendum. It would never have happened without you. And I voted for you in 2014 with the European elections. I'm normally a Conservative voter, but I backed you in that. But I do think you need to lay off Theresa May a bit now.
Oh, right. So you think 50 billion's OK, do you?
Well, it's not that point of view I'm going to get at.
Right, go on then.
I think your ideal scenario would be to rock the boat so just Theresa May falls out, and I'd like Jacob Rees Mogg to take over. But you could rock the boat too much and cause a general election. And if Jeremy Corbyn gets in, you'll be in a lot worse position than you are in now. He'll give in to everything for power.
Richard, my ideal scenario is that the Prime Minister sticks to what she said in the Lancaster House speech and the promises she made the electorate during the general election. That's all I want. That's all I want, and yet it's perfectly clear she is not prepared to do that. Now, I know the counter-argument is, don't be nasty to Mrs May, otherwise that Mr Corbyn will get in. Well, I think Richard, I'm going to throw this back the other way at you. I think she is a leader without vision, a leader without courage, a leader without humour, and I think every day she stays on as Prime Minister, Corbyn gets a little bit closer to becoming our Prime Minister.
I agree with what you're saying about her, but who takes over? Who's a better choice? Jacob Rees Mogg I can think of, but will he appeal to the left? I don't think he will. He'll pull the right with him, but he won't pull the levers with him. He'll pull the middle classes with him, but he won't tap into Corbyn's vote because he's posh. So it comes back to my point. Theresa May is the best hope we've got at the moment. I don't see no one else on the Conservative front bench who could win a general election against Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, Richard, if the choice the Tory party decides upon is along the lines of your opinion, namely, we stick with her, she's no blooming good, and we'll gossip about it.
That's what they're doing now, though, aren't they?
That's exactly what they're doing. But if they haven't got the courage to open this up and try and find a leader with vision, then they'll lose anyway, Richard. So they may as well take the risk, not just on who the leader is, but actually to try and get Brexit back on track, because it is, frankly, it has slipped already a long way off the rails.
And one thing as well, why don't you come back to frontline politics?
What do you know?
Henry Bolton's a nice guy, but he's no Farage.
Well, Richard, we'll have to see what the future holds for me. If the sellout is total, then I will have to think very, very carefully about getting my walking boots back on again. Richard, thank you for the call. And Richard's view is a view that is held by millions of Conservative voters. Oh, we have to stick with Mrs May because we don't know who else we're going to get. But hey, it's going to hell in a handcart. Anyway, I'm sure Theresa May is a principled, conscientious politician, but unfortunately, she is no leader, is what I get by text. And I would say that was quite polite, really. Robert in Basildon, do you think the Brexit people voted for is being sold down the river by this government?
Absolutely, Nigel. I'm absolutely furious, as you can probably hear from my voice.
I can.
The sheer incompetence of this government and the front bench is just staggering. You take, for instance, the negotiating strategy of this week. She's got 18 months to get the DUP on board and speak about the problems with Ireland. She leaves it to the last minute. It is total chaos. The same It's the same when she was running the election and she brought in the dementia tax. She never had the rest of the cabinet on board. Again, total chaos. It's
Now, Robert, she told us on Monday that it would all be sorted out with the European Union by the end of the week. What do you reckon the chances of that are now?
Well, who knows? It's just, you just can't believe a word what comes out of her mouth. You know, you just look around at today's events, and it's just staggering. You've got Philip Hammond sitting in front of the committee saying he's still going to pay the Brexit bill, no matter what sort of agreement we get on trade.
I found that just astonishing.
Exactly.
And talk about betrayal. I'm talking about the great Brexit betrayal. That would be a complete betrayal of the trust that he has as Chancellor with our money.
Exactly, Nigel. And not only that, I found more astonishing was Davis's performance today. He said he had 58 documents, the effects of Brexit, and it turned out to be a total and utter lie.
Well, I have to say, when he said there's no point doing impact assessments, there's no point producing all these forecasts, they're all wrong anyway, that bit of it I totally agree with. It's a waste of time. All of these forecasts, not one of them in my life has ever been anywhere near right. The problem, I think, Robert, was they did, and you can argue about the wording, but they did very much give the impression, did they not, twice over the course of the last year, that that's exactly what they were working on, and that did look a bit incompetent. But I also thought, Robert, just looking at David Davis today, you know, I know David Davis. I've always liked David Davis. Haven't always agreed with him, but I've always liked him. And he looked today just completely beaten up, as if he was totally at his wit's end. And the story on the sort of inside story, Robert, is that he's kind of been pushed out to the side, and it's now the civil servants that have taken over the entire negotiation. And I don't know, Robert. It seems to me, if she's prepared to go on making these concessions, at some point he could walk.
No, I can fully understand that, but I would have more admiration for David if he had stood up and said, listen, we don't need 58 documents to prove that Brexit forecast not always correct. There could be a positive side to Brexit. I don't need these, but to lie blatantly to the House of Commons and then to sort of fudge it in the last few weeks is, I don't know, it makes the whole team look bad.
Yeah, well,
you know, and you've got Boris Johnson, you know, as Foreign Secretary. My God, you might as well have Prince Philip. Let's be honest. You know, if you run down that front bench, you've got Amber Rudd, who's supposed to be, you know, in charge of the security in this country, and you've got 400 people coming from fighting for Syria coming over here. You know, it's just staggeringly worrying. But what I want to get to my point is that, Nigel, you look round, what's the alternative? You've got Jeremy Corbyn and Diane Abbott, my good God, and you've got Vince Cable. So, as the last caller said to you, please God that you and Stephen Wolf come back into it.
Okay, Robert, thank you.
Looking for someone to vote for.
Thank you. I get angry of Basildon there, but equally, some people are really pleased with this chaos, because Annette from Kent says, staunch Remainer, and I'm enjoying your anger. I will never give up the fight in the same way that you never have. I am one of the 48%. Davis is a disaster. Government in chaos. Bring on the general election. Well, I think Mrs May's performance this week perhaps has brought it all a little bit closer, Annette. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 7:30. A very depressing day, and indeed week, for Brexiteers, beginning on Monday, of course, with the Prime Minister trying to bounce the DUP into a deal that would have seen Northern Ireland have a very different position to the rest of the United Kingdom, through to the Chancellor, or himself, Philip Hammond, saying, we're going to pay the Brexit bill regardless whether we get anything in return, and some questions being asked by Peter Bone, Jacob Rees-Mogg, in the House of Commons, showing they're clearly pretty worried that all the things the Prime Minister laid out in her Lancaster House speech earlier this year are actually beginning to slip away. And that's very much how I feel about this. And I'm pretty worried about the whole thing. And of course, on the other side of the pond, one person who makes the news absolutely every single day is, of course, President Donald J. Trump, the 45th President of the United States of America. And here was the President earlier on today discussing the fact that America recognises Jerusalem as the Israeli capital.
I have determined that it is time to officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. While previous presidents have made this a major campaign promise, they failed to deliver. Today, I am delivering.
So the Donald delivering, as he does. He was elected on a ticket, on a manifesto. You know, tax reform, extreme vetting from predominantly Muslim but troubled countries. And one of the things that he campaigned on was to move the embassy, the American embassy in Israel, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Now, there are many people out there making strong arguments about why this is a bad idea. But I tell you something, he's hardly the first person that has ever said that. I mean, Barack Obama, you know, made some very strong words about Jerusalem being the capital of Israel. Bill Clinton actually backed the principle of moving the embassy to Jerusalem. Indeed, Mitt Romney, just a couple of years ago, backed the principle of moving the US embassy to Jerusalem. And yet when Donald Trump does it, when he keeps a promise, when he says things that other leading American politicians have said, when McDonald does it, it causes uproar. I want to try and understand why. So I'm going to DC. I'm going to LBC's Washington correspondent, Simon Marks. Hello, Simon.
How are you, Nigel?
I'm Simon, I'm well. I just, every time Trump tries to put in place a pledge from the campaign, there seems to be uproar.
Well, I mean, I think Donald Trump would argue that's because the United States is unfamiliar with presidents that make good on pledges that they've made on the campaign trail. I mean, there's also, it's fair to say, I think some domestic political benefit he hopes to this announcement because he thinks that it's going to play well with those Christian evangelical voters that backed him last November and those American Jewish voters that backed him last November. And let's be honest, his approval ratings right now are sagging, and he needs the support of every single American voter that he can possibly get, not just on this issue, but in order, if he's going to breathe new life into trying to advance other aspects of his agenda. But look, in the last 30 minutes, it's very clear that Donald Trump is going to find himself facing tremendous hostility. Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, has said just within the last few minutes that the US is choosing to go against all the international and bilateral agreements, to ignore the international consensus. And he says that as far as he's concerned, the United States, by this act, is withdrawing from the role it has played in the peace process. And so there is a knock-on effect here for Donald Trump, not just internationally, but also within his own household, because his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, has been trying to advance this Middle East peace process. The president, we heard it during Ian's programme, in his speech insisted that this move was designed to help shore that process up, and yet it looks like the Palestinians are saying the US has withdrawn from the role that it was playing, and the translation for that is that means the Palestinians are likely to walk away from the table.
Yep, and I do understand that, and certainly the language coming from the other side is strong. I just was drawing some of the historical points, Simon, that, you know, Bill Clinton had said he wanted to do this, and Mitt Romney, if he'd become the US president and beaten Obama, said he wanted to do the same thing as well. There's nothing particularly new, is there, in American politics about being heavily on side with Israel?
Well, American law since 1995 has mandated the White House, successive White Houses, to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And there's been this sort of kabuki theatre that has gone on here where successive presidents every 6 months have signed a waiver. And you heard President Trump refer to it in his remarks. That waiver essentially says, yes, we know we're supposed to be moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. We know we're supposed to be recognising Jerusalem as the capital, but we're not going to do it in the next 6 months. And Bill Clinton and George W. Bush and Barack Obama, they signed those waivers, and Donald Trump signed it already once and now says he's going to sign it one last time. Rex Tillerson has issued a statement within the last few minutes, the Secretary of State, speaking about Donald Trump's bold move on Israel and saying that the State Department will now move immediately to implement his policy. However, Donald Trump is also well aware that it's going to take years to identify a suitable site for an American embassy in Jerusalem, to build it to modern safety and security standards, and it is highly likely that if this move ever does take place, by the time it takes place, Donald Trump will not still be sitting in the White House.
Yeah, and had Obama done this, Would it, in your opinion, have met with the same degree of international condemnation?
Look, I mean, I remember when an American president walked into the Rose Garden of the White House and formally endorsed the idea of a two-state solution in the Middle East, and that was a very controversial notion at the time. This, I think, was always going to be toxic to players in the region, including those who in the last 24 hours have said they reject this idea. King Salman of Saudi Arabia, King Abdullah of Jordan. Look at King Abdullah in Jordan, the son of the late King Hussein. He's not predisposed to oppose US policy in the region. He often acts as, a behind-the-scenes wise counsel to successive American presidents. He's recoiled from this based, I think, largely because he disagrees with the policy, not because necessarily he disagrees with the personality of the individual that's implementing it.
Okay, and quickly, Simon, very big important Senate race taking place next Tuesday in Alabama. The Senate, I mean, he managed to get tax reform through, but he's struggling a bit, isn't he, with the Senate? Just give us the numbers and quickly the importance of the Alabama race.
Well, look, he absolutely can't afford to lose this race in Alabama, and as you know, Nigel, that has resulted in the President of the United States formally endorsing Roy Moore for that seat in Alabama, even though Mr. Moore is now an accused child molester and an accused sexual predator. So it's been deeply controversial that President Trump has decided to go ahead and endorse him after Mitch McConnell, the Republicans' leader in the US Senate, said that he believed the women who were making the allegations against Mr. Moore. It seems to be very evenly poised in Alabama, and for a Democrat to win there would, of course, be a simply astonishing development, given Alabama's history of Republican politics, and it would cause enormous difficulties for Donald Trump in terms of advancing his legislative agenda. He's had trouble enough with that. If the Republicans lose another seat in the US Senate, that would become very complicated for them. December 12th is the big day. We will all be watching very closely.
We will talk to you on that day, Simon Marks. Thank you very much indeed. Well, an update there from Simon Marks. So it has been written in law that they should move the embassy to Tel Aviv. It's just that no one's done it. Trump today has announced they will, but it's going to take, I think, at least 4 years for it to actually happen. Back to the Brexit mess that this government is in. At least I think it's a Brexit mess, because I think they're selling us down the river for the kind of Brexit that we voted for. There are others on the Remain side who are very encouraged by what is going on. Victor says May can go down in history for either giving in to the EU or making us free from EU rules. Her choice. Well, Victor, I think I know which way I think she's siding. David is a new caller, calling from the City of London. Good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Not a bit. Welcome. What do you think?
Well, I'm furious, and it's very interesting hearing about President Trump, because he's an incredibly decisive man. The work he's done on tax reform is fantastic for business, and it's from business's point of view that I'm speaking this evening. And we are incredibly worried, Nigel. We are being sold down the river. This negotiation is incredibly bad, huge amounts of uncertainty. And you know what, Nigel? It's a mess, isn't it?
I think it is. And I guess my worry, David, is we finish up with Brexit in name only. We've left the treaty, but we finish wrapped up inside the single market, the customs union, unable in big sectors of our economy like financial services to make ourselves more competitive. David, I think it is a mess. And that's because, in my view, the British electorate gave an instruction to the government to turn around the ship of state by 180 degrees, and you can't do that, David, in my view, unless you believe in what you're doing.
Well, quite right. Listen, I work in financial services. I'd rather not to say for which company.
Sure.
But, you know, if Theresa May messes this up, then you'll have a communist come in, a communist man who is obsessed with tarnishing our good name. You know, the media are obsessed with the PPI, LIBOR, the financial crash. It's media hysteria. And you know what? It's tarnishing people like me, Nigel, and we're going to leave. And a group of us, and I've thought about whether I'm going to say this on air, but a group of us have a WhatsApp group. We share stories and anecdotes, and we have decided to start taking action because, simply put, it's time that we started standing tall against regressive corporate hate. And, creating wealth is not a crime. We end corporate hate in this country.
I wish you luck with that, David, because one of the things that has disappeared completely within Mrs May's Conservative Party is anybody making the arguments for free markets. Anybody daring to say that success is actually a good thing. I wish you well with it, because right at the minute, you'll be swimming against a very, very powerful tide. But I thank you very much indeed for calling. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 7:47. Is Mrs May selling out on the Brexit people thought they were voting for? Looks like it to me. I wonder what William, a new caller from Falkirk in Scotland, thinks. Good evening, William.
Hi, Nigel. It's a pleasure to speak to you. I just think Project Fear has actually been a self-fulfilling prophecy. I'm very much pro-Brexit, and I'd be pro-Brexit today if it was voted again.
Yeah.
But based on the way Theresa May's got on, I think they're actually self-fulfilling their own prophecies. I think a general election is probably the only way we're going. And if Corbyn gets in, who I am completely against, absolutely disgusted with communism, but I think if that's the way we're going, sometimes things have to get worse before they get better.
Yeah, I mean, Corbyn, of course, on the European issue, is an old Bennite. He voted against every single European treaty all through his career in the House of Commons. And I'm sorry to see him effectively now. He's the hostage of a Blairite parliamentary party, the Hillary Benns and all these people. And if you listen to Sir Keir Starmer, he's actually all about keeping Britain in the single market and customs union, I think in perpetuity, is kind of the view that he takes. So if May has let her voters down on this, actually, what the Labour Party have done is utterly contemptuous of the 4 to 5 million Labour voters out there who support Brexit, and yet who were assured by Corbyn and co, vote for us, we'll take Britain out of the single market, and we will, of course, take back border control. So what they've done is pretty dastardly. But you feel, William, I mean, do you think a general election could sort this out?
I think it'll make things worse. I'll be a Conservative. I'm actually a DUP Conservative. But I just think the way Theresa May, a Remainer, has basically self-fulfilled her prophecy.
Yeah.
And she's absolutely destroyed this whole Brexit thing.
Yeah, she never believed in it, William, did she? She never believed in it.
Never.
No.
Never.
Do you see somebody, I mean, because all it needs is 48 letters to be lodged with the chairman of the Conservative Party's 1922 committee to trigger a leadership challenge. And the story, William, we have is that 40 letters are lodged already. It needs 8 more and there'll be a leadership contest. Do you see a shining knight coming over the hill, William, that can save Brexit?
I would love it, Nigel. I would absolutely love it. It would be a dream, but I'm not getting my hopes up. Basically,
and do you see anybody that might qualify?
Well, Jacob would be a no question, no-brainer.
Okay, fine.
Boris is a fake. I think he's proven himself to be a fake on a number of issues. I think Jacob is the only answer, and that would be, if all the stars aligned,
all right,
Jacob, it would be happy days.
All right, okay, William, they're a DUP Conservative supporter who thinks we're headed in a very bad direction under Mrs May, which I have to say I take very much the same view. Stephen is calling from Stoke-on-Trent. Good evening, Stephen.
Good evening, Nigel. Thank you for having me on the show.
Well, I am deeply sceptical about the way the Prime Minister's dealing with this. Tell me I'm wrong, Stephen.
I think you are wrong. So I am a passionate Theresa May supporter, and I think, do you know what? Why are we not just letting her getting on with the job? We've got a running commentary from the media, from politicians, about they want this, they want that. Do you know what? She's in the toughest negotiation of our lives, and things change, things chop and change, but nobody seems to want to allow her the freedom to go and do that. And it's so frustrating because great leadership is about things do change. You have to change your mind. You have to adapt. But nobody wants her to do that. Everybody wants this running commentary of Brexit this, and I wanted this, and they should do this, and they should do that. Do you know what? Nothing is agreed, like she said, until it's agreed. Let her get on with the job.
Well, Stephen, I could buy that argument had it not been for what happened on Monday, where she colluded with a foreign government to withhold a proposed deal from a Northern Irish political party that is keeping her government in power in the hope they could effectively be bounced in to accepting a constitutional change for a part of this country that may well have led to Scotland, Wales, London, and goodness knows where else demanding a different deal. Had we just let her get on with it, she'd have signed that piece of paper.
But would she, though? I mean, would she have signed that piece of paper? Do we know that? I mean, do we know that she would have gone in there?
Well, what we do know is all the briefing in Brussels, all the upbeat optimism that was coming out of that Berlaymont European Commission building that morning, everybody was cock-a-hoop. We were, literally, in their terminology, a few metres away from a very major agreement being reached.
But, I suppose for me, and I'm doing it in simplistic terms, I'm not in this kind of world, but, when you're in a negotiation, things like that have to be on the table. You have to consider everything. Now, there's going to be things that you'll say, absolutely not, I'm not considering that, but do you know what? It's about being flexible and saying, well, I can't do that, but I could do this. And I just wonder, I really like Theresa May, and I think she's in an impossible situation. She's surrounded by a bunch of Conservative men who have had it their own way for a long, long time. She's come in, and actually, do you know what? It's really refreshing to see somebody like her, I believe. She isn't as charismatic as David Cameron, and I get that. She isn't great at public speaking, but do you know what? I think she's doing the right thing. We're just going to let her get on with it.
What would you do, Stephen, if you were Theresa May tonight and your Chancellor of the Exchequer had said, we're prepared to pay this gargantuan exit bill, regardless whether we get any deal in return? How would you feel tonight as Conservative Party leader?
Well, I'd sack him, to be honest.
Right, very good. Now, Stephen, if she starts doing things like that, I may well come and join your club, OK? But I don't think she's going to.
I just wish she had. I wish she had the guts to get rid of him, to get rid of the ones who keep backbiting about her and say, do you know what? If I'm going to go fighting. And that's what I wanted to do.
OK.
I wanted to stand up for what she believes
Stephen, you and I can meet in the middle on this. We started off disagreeing fundamentally. If she shows guts over Hammond, if she was to go back and say, right, I really am going to stick to the principles of the Lancaster House Agreement, do you know what, Stephen? I would give the loudest cheer that's ever been heard on commercial radio in the history of these islands. I promise you. Thank you. I've got time for Tim from Kingston, a new caller. Haven't got long, Tim. What do you think?
Hi, Nigel. Thanks for having me on. Just very quickly, it was interesting listening to the last guy you had on, because it talked about sort of Theresa May being a great lead. I mean, great leadership's about kind of vision and planning and preparation and guts, I think was the phrase used. I mean, what was interesting is there were, from what I understand, there were three issues in the negotiation this week. Financial settlement, rights of EU citizens, and the border.
Yep.
And basic 101 of negotiation, they didn't go and talk to Eileen Foster previously about the deal. I mean, it's sort of comedically silly that you wouldn't get. I mean, it's because, Tim,
they thought they could bounce her into it. They didn't think she'd stand up for principle.
If your government is propped up by 10 seats from the DUP, at the very least, you would imagine that you'd kind of have the brains to go and do that. And then so you sort of, it's extraordinary. I mean, I sort of disagree. The financial settlement. I mean, I'm sort of slightly differ with you on that one. I mean, whether it's too much or not. I mean, it depends what we get for it. I'd say. But the David Davis thing is absolutely extraordinary. I mean,
Are they incompetent, Tim?
Well, it's coming across that way, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is.
3 weeks. I mean, I voted to remain.
Yeah.
And over the last 3 weeks, I've been watching this play out with amazement, but not in a good way.
No. Tim, I'm going to have to let you go. We've run out of time. Final comment goes to Damien on Facebook, who says, Brexit is a rudderless boat with a clueless crew. U-turn, ahoy. You've been listening to The Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. I'm back tomorrow night at 7. Coming up at 10 this evening, it's Ian Collins. But up next, continuing this discussion, it's Clive Bull.
Thanks very much indeed.